Hey guys, Boogie here with another Project Nova news update. This is actually the third episode in our series here, and since all this information is kind of building off of one another, I do suggest you go check out episodes 1 and 2 over on the channel before you watch this one. In this episode, we're going to be going over the different Dropsuits and classes in Project Nova. Do keep in mind that while all of this is based off of information released directly by the developers, the game is still in active development, and do expect some changes by the time the game is released. So before we get started, I want to review the Dropsuits and how they were set up in Dust. This is primarily so I can point out some key differences between the two games. So in Dust, you had 3 weight classes. You had the light Dropsuits, the medium, and then the heavy Dropsuits. And this kind of was a broad way of describing the hitbox, the speed, and the HP of different types of suits. You also had 4 basic tiers, which was kind of a power level. So you had Militia, Standard, Advanced, and Prototype. There were 2 other kind of pseudo tiers, which was Apex and Officer, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to leave those out of this discussion. So when you first started playing Dust, you were presented with starter Dropsuits, and these were effectively pre-fit Dropsuits. They had the modules already slotted into them, and they were kind of just pick them up and they're good to go. And this was actually really great for new players because they hadn't learned the fitting system yet, but it did kind of give them a suit that they could use and, learn the game, which was really helpful. However, stat-wise, these were really outclassed by pretty much everything else in the game. So while they were good for your initial foray into the game, you were expected to kind of graduate from them over time. So the next set of suits that you would be exposed to would be the frame suits. So you had a frame suit for basically each weight class, but you also had 4 racial variants of all those frame suits. So you'd have an Amar, a Caldari, a Minmatar, and a Gallente heavy frame. And similarly, you would have, the Amar, Caldari, Gallente, Minmatar light, and also the same for the medium frame suits. And these were meant to be very general purpose. They didn't have any bonuses. They weren't really suited towards a specific role. It was just kind of a broad, generalized suit. So starting with that, you already had 12 Dropsuits, and that's not even counting the 4 main tiers. So already there's a lot of suits that you're looking at when you first start playing the game. So after those 12 base frame Dropsuits, you have what were kind of known as the primary class Dropsuits. And these were more specialized, they were kind of a higher tier, and overall what you were expected to get to once you got past those frame suits. So the heavy frame suit branched into 2 suits. It was the Sentinel and the Commando. So the Sentinel was a defensive suit. It was designed to have lots of HP, it could use heavy weapons, and its primary purpose was kind of point defense. The Commando, however, was also a heavy suit, but could not use heavy weapons. However, it could use 2 light weapons, whereas most other classes could only use 1. Then you had the medium frame suit, and that would branch into the assault suit and the logistics suit. So the assault suit was a frontline suit. It had really good defense, good mobility, overall just very well rounded and kind of your standard class you'd find in a first-person shooter. The logistics, on the other hand, was much more of a support-oriented role. It specialized in using equipment which would support the team, such as repair tools, drop uplinks, nano hives, that sort of thing. And finally, you had the light frame suit, which would branch into just the scout suit. There's only one advancement for that one. And the scout suit was very based around electronic warfare and stealth. So they could use cloaks, they had really good scanning, they could hide well from scanners, and overall kind of acted as the assassins of the game. So you effectively had 5 classes in Dust, but you also had, again, the 4 racial variants. So, for example, you'd have your assault suit, but there would be an Amar, a Caldari, a Minmatar, and a Gallente version of that suit. So already right there, you have 20 more Dropsuits, and then if you layer on each of the 4 tiers, that's 80 suits right there. So when you're looking at it, you have well over 100 Dropsuits when you look at the whole scope of the game. And this is great for players because you have lots of options, and I think lots of options are great for variation. It drives a good meta. However, the way that it was structured is that as a new player, when you came into the game, you were expected to pretty much pick which racial variant you wanted right away before you even had a chance to play the class, which, unless you knew from, let's say, playing EVE, or you did extensive research to kind of know what the racial doctrine for that suit's going to be, you're not going to have a very good idea of what it's going to play like until you actually invest the SP and the time into it, and that wasn't really a great design, unfortunately. So Project Nova has a lot of similarities to the way things were done in Dust, but there are some key differences. So in Project Nova, all of the classes are broken up into 2 major categories. So you kind of have your direct combat suit and you have your support suits. So direct combat is very much centered around pushing the objective, attacking the enemy, being aggressive and trying to get kills, capture the point, that sort of thing. Now, the way that each of the classes within this category do that will vary depending on the class, but overall that's kind of the general theme behind it. The support classes, on the other hand, focus around supporting the functions of the team overall. So they are going to be the kind of classes that provide defensive abilities, area denial, healing, supplies, transportation, that sort of thing. And the important thing to take away from this is that just because they are a support class does not mean that they are incapable of defending themselves. They are more than able to kill the enemy, they can defend themselves, they can certainly be lethal, but the big difference is that direct combat classes will have bonuses that obviously help them, do direct combat, whereas the support type classes will have bonuses that help them support the team. So everyone is viable in a gunfight, it's just some will have bonuses that support that a little bit more than others. So on top of all that, each class is going to have a specific ability assigned to it. So this is an ability that is unique to that class, it cannot be emulated by another class. And while details have not been very specific on what these abilities are going to be, terms like hover, dash, and bull rush have been thrown around. So we don't have specifics about what those are going to be yet, but it should be interesting to see what they come up with. So let's go through all of the classes that we're going to have in Project Nova. So starting with the direct combat classes, you have the Vanguard. And the Vanguard is kind of the renamed Commando from Dust. It's a heavy drop suit, it can use 2 primary weapons, and it kind of acts as this very tough, heavy frontline fighter. Then you have the Assault. It is a medium drop suit with good mobility, good defense. It's a very well-rounded suit and will feel very familiar to people who play other FPS games. And then you have the Infiltrator, which is a light drop suit, and it specializes in assassination and stealth. So it's going to have access to a cloak, it's going to be difficult to detect on scanners, and will play really well for people who like to play fast, stealthy builds. So moving into the support classes, we have the Sentinel. So the Sentinel is a heavy drop suit, it specializes in point defense, it's going to have very high HP and be very difficult to kill, but also be very slow in the process. Then you have the Logistics. The Logistics is a medium drop suit. It's going to have focus on providing different kind of support roles to the team, such as healing, dropping nano hives for supplies and ammo. And then you have the Marksman, which is a light drop suit. It's going to specialize in long-range combat, so sniper rifles, that sort of thing. So really good for those of you who like to fight from a distance. So a key difference here is that there are not going to be racial variants of each of these classes. So you're not going to have an Amar, Caldari, Galente, and Minmatar version of every type of class. It's a single drop suit for the base class. Now that being said, there are variants, which we'll talk about in a minute, but first I want to go over how the drop suits are manufactured. So in Dust, you had drop suits that were effectively manufactured by each of the 4 nations. You would have an Amar drop suit and a Caldari drop suit, etc., etc. In Nova, it is not the nation that is manufacturing the drop suit, but specifically corporations that are producing these drop suits. So in Dust, for example, you would have a Caldari Assault drop suit. In Nova, however, it would be a Calakiota Assault drop suit. So while Calakiota is associated with the Caldari state, it does not necessarily mean that every drop suit must be manufactured by a corporation that is tied to a nation. So, for example, you could have Sisters of Eve, which is not really associated with a specific nation, but it could produce, say, like the Logistics drop suit. Now, this is actually kind of nice because it does open up a lot more options for different types of manufacturers for drop suits. So, before, while you were tied to the 4 nations, now there's lots of NPC corporations in New Eden which could produce drop suits. So, it opens up a lot of options, and also kind of gets away from this expectation that you're going to have 4 of every type of drop suit. Now that being said, for the base 6 drop suit classes, there is a single manufacturer for each class. You're not going to have multiple different types of manufacturers making the base drop suit for each class. But that does lead me to talking about the variations I mentioned before. So the base 6 classes represent the most general way to play that class. But that doesn't mean that there isn't room for variation. That's where firmware comes into play. So I'll discuss drop suit progression in a later video because that's a very big topic. However, as you level up your drop suit, you'll eventually gain access to fit firmware to the drop suit. So firmware is a special module that gets fitted to a unique slot in the drop suit, and it modifies a number of things such as base HP, movement speed, fitting resource, but most importantly it overwrites the base roll bonuses of the suit and replaces them with a more specialized version. So, for example, the Creodron organization could build the Assault drop suit, and it might come with a base roll bonus of, say, plus 10% bonus to sprint speed, and plus 10% bonus to plasma weapon damage. Now, you could have Duval Labs that produces a special type of firmware for the assault suit. So let's say I slot this firmware in, and it overwrites the base roll bonuses and replaces them with something that's more specialized. So for this example, it could be something that is more focused around mobility. So instead of plus 10 to sprint speed and plus 10 to damage, you can now have plus 20% to sprint speed, but only plus 5 to damage. So overall, it's a net gain, but definitely more specialized in a certain direction. So as such, firmware is considered a consumable item. So like we discussed in the last episode, a consumable item is used once at the end of the match, regardless if you die or not, and it is not consumed per death. Also, as a side bonus, when you fit a firmware, it actually will give your drop suit a unique skin that is unique to that firmware. However, if you don't like it, you can always slot in a skin module and it will overwrite the firmware skin. So while we don't have a racial variant of each of the drop suit classes, using firmware allows you to effectively create variants for that drop suit once it gets to a high enough level. Also, because firmware can be manufactured by any of the NPC corporations within New Eden, it allows for a lot more different variations as opposed to Dust, which really only allowed for the 4 variants from each of the nations. Now, the big advantage to all of this is, of course, in Nova, you are presented as a new player with 6 classes. They're readily named as things that you've probably seen in other FPS games, so you know generally how they're going to perform overall. However, as you learn the game, as you level up, you're going to gain access to firmware, and this is going to allow players who have now learned something about the game to pick what specialization they want to go into, and then really dive into it. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this Project Nova news update. Catch us next time as we talk about progression for drop suits and weapons in the game. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and for all of the most up-to-date Project Nova news, stay tuned to biomast.com.